Sorry for my tardiness. A little traffic, and John Cunningham will be joining us late. Yeah, exactly. Let's start with introductions. Last time we started to the right. Let's go left.
Dina Lacal-Caltrans.
Kevin Rohani, City of Oakley.
Eric Hughes, City of Pleasant Hill.
Steve Kirschvan, City of Brentwood.
Tom Horaeus, Tri-Delta Transit.
Andy Dillard, Town and Danville.
I'm Jerry Fay with Contra Costa County.
Ahmed Abwali, City of Antioch.
James Hinkamp, City of Lafayette.
Jeremy Lukirko, City of Walnut Creek.
Heather Ballinger, City of Walnut Creek, and City County Engineers.
Barbara Hawkins, City of San Pablo and WICTAC.
Jim Conradi, AC Transit.
Leah Greenblatt, WICTAC.
I see Avetta coming in.
City of El
Next up is public comment. It's where the public can speak before the board. I have no speaker cards. So moving on to item C, approval of summary of action. Do I have a motion?
I'll move. Second.
Got a motion and a second. All those in favor? Aye. All opposed? Abstain? Motion passes. So next we have the consent calendar. Do I have a motion? Second?
Second.
Have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passed. Which brings us to item 5. Stephanie?
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. This is an information item. Attached are some monitoring reports for your information, and just a reminder that projects that are programmed for fiscal year 16-17 need to submit the request for authorization, or E76, by November 1st of this year. We have 8 projects programmed, and 2 have requested to be moved out to next year, fiscal year, and 1 that's already been obligated. And these are shown on page 5-6. And also another reminder to please submit invoices to Caltrans in a timely manner. And on page 5-8, there's a inactive report that shows what projects require some action in terms of invoicing. But just to note, that report is dated a couple weeks ago, way before the mail out. So if you can just take a look and make sure your projects are not on the list, and if so, please take the proper action to work with Caltrans to submit the invoices. And that's it. If you have any questions, I can answer them. Thank you.
Moving on to item 6. Yeah, that's you, Brad.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to talk about the proposed coordinated call for projects for the federal OBAG 2 program and the Measure J TLC and PBTF programs. We talked about this last month, and what we've done is gotten together a cover memo and 3 program guidelines for the 3 programs. The call for projects itself describes how much funding is available, summarizes the 3 programs, their purposes, their requirements, outlines the schedule for the call for projects and the process for submitting applications. Since there'll be 1 application, it's in this cover sheet. Then there are 3 separate guidelines for the 3 separate programs. They all have slightly different requirements, either coming from MTC and the federal government in the case of, and Caltrans in the case of the OBAG 2 program, or from Measure J for the 2 Measure J programs. Since the last meeting, we did a few things. One thing is that we now know that we are going to be getting some more money through the FAST Act. It's The total amount is increased from 56.1 million up to 56.1 million. It was about 51.5 million. The majority of the funding was STP money, and that we have used the same approach where we put STP funding towards formula local streets and roads preservation portion of the OBAG program. We still don't have final language on the housing displacement policy, but MTC did make a final decision. We haven't gotten the final wording, but we do know that I listened into the meeting, and I know they did take an action. Basically, they require us to adopt a specific scoring methodology for selecting projects within the priority development areas or transit priority areas that reward jurisdictions with the most effective housing anti-displacement policies. What we've done is to add in a new criterion in the OBAG scoring that gives extra points for the number of housing anti-displacement policies that jurisdictions has, and in that we would rely on work that UC Berkeley has done at a survey of all the jurisdictions in the Bay Area on their housing anti-displacement policies. There is I won't call it a program, but there is a couple of researchers at UC Berkeley that have looked into the what they call urban displacement issue, and they have quite a bit of research that we're proposing to rely on, and then the scoring. It does also include a new criterion. It's a screening criterion that every agency applying for funding must adopt a new surplus lands resolution. And it's a resolution stating that the jurisdiction has adopted policies that comply with the State Surplus Land Act as amended by AB 2135. And that act requires that when a jurisdiction has surplus land, they first offer it to developers of affordable housing. And to be eligible for OBAG funding, your jurisdiction has to make sure and adopt a resolution. We're hoping that MTC will provide us a model resolution, they have not yet, that the jurisdiction will need to adopt to be eligible for the funding. We also clarified a few criteria from the last time and clarified the call for projects. There are two things that we would like to bring up today to get your input on. One thing is that we would like to, as we've done in the past, limit the number of applications so that for each of the three programs, no agency can apply for more than one, submit more than one application for each of the three. So only one OBAG, only one TLC, only one PBTF. They can be the same one because you can apply for funding through OBAG and you can apply for funding through TLC to fund the same project. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. We'd also like to allow the county to have two applications because it covers the whole county and is a much larger jurisdiction. And the second thing we want to suggest is that when the RTPCs submit their projects for the TLC funding, because the RTPCs are the ones who review and rank the projects for funding through that program, that they submit a recommended list of about 125% of their share of the TLC funds. That will give us an opportunity, if they do apply for multiple funding sources, for us to shift the funds around to make sure that the projects are funded in the most efficient way. And that will require some work on our end once we get the recommended projects from the different programs. Now, I mentioned earlier that we want to allow jurisdictions and agencies to apply for different programs for the same for the same project. So if you had a project, you could apply to be funded with OBAG 2 funds and use that as the primary source, and even to request Measure J funds as the local match for that program, for that project. And also, at the same time, apply for either TLC or PBTF, as well as the either 100% or 50% of the needed funding to complete the project, which makes the application a little more difficult to put together, and we're hoping not too confusing. But that is one of the things that would be the benefit of having a coordinated call for projects, is that we can fund larger projects, that we can match the funding to the projects and make a better match if possible. And it'd be a way to use the local Measure J funding as the local match for the federal funding. So those are the basic things. We're putting together an application. We didn't want to do the final application until we heard from you. We're going to try to run the application by the working group that we worked with to put together the initial proposal that we took to you last month, to see whether they think the application is clear and makes sense and is something that people can fill out. So with that, I've given the overview, and I'm hoping to hear comments from you and try to answer your questions.
Kevin, you got a comment? No?
I have a bunch, but I don't know if you want to start with me and let others go first.
Barbara?
Yes, I was wondering, I didn't see it mentioned anywhere, but I'm not sure, it's kind of new, the green infrastructure, if that's going to be eligible at all for the funding. It is a transportation, it's climate improvement.
It will depend on what it
category?
is.
Oh.
If you get STP fund, well, let's take your formula share. If you're talking about OBAG, the competitive portion, it would not be in almost all cases, because those projects need to have an air quality benefit. Because the competitive portion is going to be funded entirely out of CMAQ funds, which has got that required air quality tie. The local formula, local streets and roads preservation, that portion will all be STP funds, Surface Transportation Program funds, and that can be used for a very wide range of transportation improvements. So that if you were to rehab a street with those funds, and you included, say, rain gardens along that street, and the street has to be on the federal aid system, then that would be an eligible part of that project. That's my understanding.
Okay, thank you.
Well, yeah. Why don't you go, and then we can all just piggyback on yours.
Excellent.
You can pile on.
First of all, I think, thank you, Brad, because I think this is a really complicated situation where you're trying to blend it and make it easier for the jurisdictions when applying. And it's a lot of complicated overlapping thoughts, and it takes a lot of organizational skill to bring it all together. That said, I have some comments that I think will help make certain parts clearer and easier for the people who aren't around this table to understand, what's going on. And I tend to, I think those types of comments I could just pass on to Brad, and it's just kind of, and I can give you an example of them, but I don't want to waste everybody's time on that. But then I have some other kind of bigger policy types of questions. So I'll give you an example of the kind that I'd like to just pass on to Brad. So on page 6-5 of the packet, there's kind of the first group of bullets, and then you get to the middle of the page, and there's a paragraph that starts at its July 2016 meeting. I think that if I'm reading this quickly as an outsider, all the key points are in the bullets above, but then this is an important element that should be a bullet. So I would just rework that so it's a part of a bullet, and then you put an asterisk to explain the unusual situation where it got added later.
Yeah, I was hoping that once we finally got the final language from MTC that I would revise that to, because the bullets are a direct quote out of Resolution 4202, which established OBAG 2. As they revise it, those bullets will be revised, and I would use the exact language.
Okay. I didn't know how much like verbatim this was going forward or not, so that's why I had those kind of comments. So then on the next page, 6-6, the first table, it was unclear to me how these dollar amounts were calculated. And I think as I'm reading through the document later on, I find that out, but you either want to make a reference to that later part of the document or state it here. And then what comes up a lot throughout the next couple pages is this list of safe routes to school projects, federal aid, and planning and outreach. I would just make sure that you list those in the same order each time, because as I'm flipping through trying to figure this out, sometimes the planning and outreach get combined with the FAS, and then they're in a different order, and just for consistency, it'll help folks. That wasn't too bad. Page 6-8. Up at the top of the page, you mention that, or you don't mention that there's the extra % for West County. And can you just add an asterisk to the table that says what that extra amount is and that it's included in that dollar amount?
That's the first table? Or
Yeah, the top of, yeah.
That's true for the second table as well.
Yes, it would be. Okay, then I'm on to page 6-10 and have a more meaningful comment. On the second line, it talks about the Measure J working group to work, and I'm wondering, what does this involve? What that they're preparing this coordinated funding program. I think I found that out afterwards as I read through the whole thing, but if maybe you want to put a reference there or something.
Are you suggesting to go into a little more detail on?
Well, if I was only reading like this introductory part, I was possibly applying for the funds, I'd want to know how this working group might be tweaking with the funding program. So I know you discuss it a little bit further, a little in more detail a little bit later, so you might add, see page X for that, but
Yeah, I think it goes into greater detail in the program guidelines for OBAG too, and I can add in more detail here. That's a completely reasonable thing to do.
And I'll give you a suggested revision for that last sentence later on in that paragraph, because I think that could be clearer. Moving on to page 6-14. The first full paragraph, it starts, Contra Costa will receive. And then I think it set aside funds specifically for the CMA planning and outreach group. Is there a formula that was used? And if so, I just referenced the formula in that section.
Yeah, they're all exact amounts.
Yeah. By a formula.
No formula. I have no idea why. Well, I do have an idea why the Safe Routes to School. I've never quite understood the FAS formula. It comes from the state, and there's nothing. I haven't been able to find a formula for how they came up with that number.
Okay.
We've decided on the CMA planning. It's just an escalated amount on how much we get now. The Safe Routes to School share is based on enrollment and population. And I could add some more if you guys think it would be helpful to know where the numbers come from.
All right, then there's, I guess it would be the paragraph that starts the remaining $46 million can be used for any of the eligible projects. Then at the last sentence there it says, however, or the Contra Costa program, however, will not fund grants for PCA projects. And I think it would be helpful just to have a sentence in there explaining why. And then page 6-15, the first real paragraph sentence, I guess, when it talks about projects being on the federal aid system, at the OBAG working group, we talked about having links to those types of pages so people could find them easier.
Yeah, I missed that one. By the way, I don't know if any of you looked at those maps, but they're really, really hard to navigate.
Okay, then page 619, there's a paragraph that kind of rolled over from the prior page, and then near the bottom of that paragraph, it refers to toll credits in lieu of a match. I didn't understand what that meant.
Yeah, I can add an explanation. It's a little complicated. It's very useful, but it's complicated.
Can you tell us what it means?
It is possible. I don't know all the mechanics of it, but MTC has some money it's not federal money, and it comes from toll credits. They can use it as a local match in certain cases. So one way that they use it is if you've already done some preliminary work on, say, environmental or the design for the project and only used local money. Normally, you have to match all phases of the program, and the toll credits allow you to not have to go through that process. It sort of helps you on the local match issue. And they use the toll credits as a local match. It's for earlier phases. I don't know all the mechanics of it, but that's the basic idea.
So is there a reference you can send the person to so they'll know how to use the toll credits?
Hisham can.
Yeah, I'll try to explain. It's still complicated. But normally, when you spend your federal money on a phase, let's say you have money programmed for the construction phase, if you go through local assistance, the normal way, basically they'll ask you to match it at specific ratio, 11.47%. Now, what toll credits give you, you're really not getting any additional money. All what you're doing, basically by invoking the toll credit, you're basically being allowed to use whatever you spent on the other phases, the design, the environmental, as a match to your construction cost. That way, when you send an invoice for the construction cost, you'll be reimbursed 100% as opposed to 88.53%. Up to 100%. So that's, I have some explanation we can add to this but every time I say toll credit, I get a question. So I'm not sure how much it will help.
See Hisham in here.
So
Thank
anyway, when you program the project in the TIP, basically there is a box you click if you want to take advantage of toll credit. If Caltrans sees that box checked, then basically they'll be more flexible by not requiring you to match your money on the construction phase.
Thank you. On page 6-28, the criteria about dense job centers, how will that be determined? I know there's the breakdown, but where does the information come for that?
We were proposing to use the information from ABAG on the existing land use and forecast land use, depending on what the criterion is. That would be true for the past housing growth, for the forecast housing growth, the dense job centers near housing, and dense job centers near transit. That would use those adjoining TAZs within a half mile of the project area.
Okay, I didn't know it. I got that. So 629, quality transit service. Well, on the scoring, the possible scores, there's 2 that get 3 points possibly.
Sorry, it should be 43210. Thanks for catching that.
And then the next page, project readiness. This might mess with your math, but the project has NEPA clearance, you get 8 points, but the maximum score says 6. Same with the sponsor's delivery record.
Right, yeah. I should say that to make room for the housing displacement, what we did was to reduce, originally the project readiness and sponsor delivery record were 8 points. So to make room for the 4 points for housing displacement, we reduced these to 6 points. There still gives a little bit more of a bump to those 2 criteria. But as you noted, I didn't change the scores when I changed the total max.
And then on 631, the matching funds, I didn't understand how, why are they asking for money if they have 100% or greater? What?
I guess I had the same question, but I guess we reasoned that if it's a $100,000 project, you're asking for $50,000, you're giving $50,000, that's your 100%. That's your match? Is that how you're?
Right.
So I thought the same thing. Why are they asking for money? But it's really 50% of your project cost is the grant.
Okay.
50% your local match. There's your 100% local match. Right? I mean,
Yeah, and if the project cost $10 million, and you're only asking for $1 million in grant funding, I mean, the match would be 900%, and you still wouldn't get more points than that, but 100% would be, the same, you were providing a local match that was the same as the requested grant amount. And it was basically a slope function where you get 0 points when it crosses the line at 11.47 and it's normalized to 8.
So my next question, comment, suggestion comes from a discussion I had with Yvette after our last TCC meeting, and when we were talking about geographic equity. Did you have this?
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about it? It's for baby, which I thought was a great idea.
Yeah, one of my comments after the meeting last month was looking at the geographical equity where we're proposing to fund one project per subregion or the highest scoring project per subregion. But we could end up with a situation that the second highest scoring of all projects in all regions would not be funded. And so in order to allow for that second project to be funded, we probably should consider reducing the maximum grant amount that you can apply for so that that situation wouldn't happen or minimize that from happening.
Or I was thinking that
Go ahead.
if I understood what maybe it was another part of our conversation, but that let's say you have, 5 projects and the top 4 are like the 5th project is an unrepresented in the top 4. So it's from a different RTPC. So, or maybe it's further down, like whatever RTPC doesn't have a project, maybe it's like the 8th ranked project or something. But if that's a big project of like $5 million, do you want to bump that all the way up to the top and give that $5 million project full funding and kind of bypass all those other projects that ranked higher? Or do you want to set like a minimum or I guess a maximum score, or sorry, a maximum dollar amount that you'd fund that outlier project with?
But this 8th project is the number 1 project in that particular region.
Yeah.
7 ahead of it, but not necessarily. Okay.
Yeah. So like it could take up a big chunk of money, but it hasn't scored as well. But, you still want to have some I think possibly geographic equity, but it doesn't, I don't know. I want to see what people thought about that. Do you remember talking about that one?
Yeah, I remember that too. I think it was both. It was a combination of do you reduce the maximum amount that's awarded per project to account for that situation, or how do you prorate it, the funding that project is eligible for?
That's an option. And that's the problem with geographic equity, is that you would fund a lower ranking project just because it happens to be in one area of the county and not another. And it would be even more noticeable if that lower ranked project that was to be funded asked for the maximum amount of money, which is certainly possible. One option is that if it's lower ranked, that you reduce the amount, not the amount that any one project can ask for, but that project would be allowed to have. I don't know how you would figure out what that lower amount would be. That's certainly a way to sort of reduce it's not the geographic inequity, but it would be the inequity in scoring. Or you ask the RTPC that has that lower ranked project to make some of that money, that lower amount, up with TLC funding, which they do have control over.
I guess I had a related comment too. Aren't we partially addressing some of the geographic equity by dividing the LSRP money based on the amount of, what is the formula for the LSRP? Mileage and population?
Yeah, 50%, 50%.
So there's already some geographical equity for more than half of the money that's available for all the jurisdictions.
Yeah, it's about 60%. 55%.
I don't know what all the silence means.
I have a question. I'm kind of going off what Lee had said. On the dense job centers on page 18, section 6-28, you said that it was for existing land use. You would be looking at existing land use and what's forecasted. When you say existing land use, you're talking about actual or zone?
It would be the actual.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I can have people, give people time to ponder
Yeah.
that last one. And
We can come back to that one. Oh, John, sorry.
Thank you. I think I have a follow-up question to Leah and Yvette's question regarding the funding amounts, and it goes to a statement on page 6-15. Some additional STP may be allocated through the competitive OBEG 2 subprogram, et cetera, et cetera. And if I'm following your question, if I understand this correctly, if we use the STP dollars, then our formula funds will be reduced. Is that correct? Before I ask my question, I want to make sure I'm following the logic and the scheme.
Well, the idea was that there's about 16 million, I think. I'm trying to remember the revised amount. It was 16 million before we got extra money. And that's the reason why the working group recommended, instead of having a max of 6 million for a request, we had a max of 5 million. So, but what if we had each region's top scoring project was 5 million? That would be $20 million. There isn't $20 million in CMAQ available, and in that case, to make the projects whole, we would take some of the STP money proportionally from each jurisdiction, from their local streets and road share, and put it towards the project to make it whole, all of the full 4 projects whole.
Okay, thank you. And then I guess my question then is there a theoretical or a mathematical maximum that formula would be reduced, or is there a range, or do we need to talk about capping it, or I guess, what it seems like a potentially large variable.
Sorry. You can't hear me if I don't turn on the mic. Let me look at the amount of funding there is. Okay, there's $28 million right now that we're proposing that would go towards local streets and roads. That's on page 6-25. And there's about, the remainder is 17.9 or 18 million. So if you had 5, would be the max. If you had 4 or $5 million projects, that'd be 20. So that's $2 million that we'd have to take, a little more, we'd have to take out of the local streets and roads pot. So 2 million less, so it'd be 26 around, 26 million. So that's, I can't do this in my head. It's about 6% drop. Is that right? About right?
To trust your mouth.
I'm not sure I would, but
I'm sure it's better than mine.
10%. So it'd be 10%. So Contra Costa County would get 3.9 million instead of 4.5 million, for example. Antioch would get 2 million instead of 2.2 million.
That's great. Thank you.
That kind of math I can do.
Right. For some reason, I thought the potential to be quite a bit larger. I had a few other questions, but Leah was on a roll. I don't want to interrupt her. I can jump back in, or should I keep going?
You're sitting there. I defer you to you.
Okay.
Can I go back, though, to one of the things that Brad was just saying? When you reduce from the local agencies, their local streets and roads share, to these other high-priority projects for each region, is there going to be some regional significance to the project so that for some reason they're giving up their money so that that's a good cause for them?
I'm not exactly sure what your question is, but I mean, assuming that one of the reasons that you might have this situation occur is that you have 4 projects that presumably score well, one in each of the regions, so that we have some sense that they're good projects. So will a jurisdiction be happy about having less local streets and roads? I know it's like paying taxes. Are you happy about paying taxes? You think about all the good that your taxes do, so you go, yeah, okay, I understand it.
But
you know, we would all like to have more money to do things.
But in one of the criteria in identifying these top projects that would be getting some of the money that the local streets and roads funds would have to give up their share for, is there some regional significance that project would have so that the local agencies would then say, yeah, I'm not getting as much of my local streets and roads, but this project's going to help me out in a way?
I'll have to ask you to define regional significance. Is it just benefit that benefits the whole county, the whole region? Does it just West County or East County or other parts of the county? Is that a regional significance?
For the, the west or the central or each region.
We presume that if they scored well enough to be the top scoring project in the region, that it has some benefit that more beneficial than any of the other projects that applied for funding.
Barbara, if we want to ensure the project has regional significance, maybe what we would have to do is give more points to projects that span more than one jurisdiction in the scoring criteria. That will ensure that the project is benefiting more than one jurisdiction at least. I mean, that if you want to really go that route, then it would require that we add something to the criteria for that.
Right. Thank you.
Can I just ask one more follow-up on this? Is this up for debate? Can we, vote no on this? So, I mean,
we hope that you don't vote no on all of it.
No, I didn't mean all of it.
We are completely open to making changes to this. That's why we bring it to you.
Well, I guess, as you said earlier, that everybody wants as much money as they can, but some of these agencies that are in here, they get very little money and they don't get the big regional projects, and this is their only piece of the pie. And so for me, even if it's a 10% reduction, that's, speaking for them, or all of us for that matter, that is a concern. So I would just want to debate this more before we voted yes, but that's just me.
It's true that every jurisdiction, some more than others, have great needs for maintaining their system. I know that there are 8 groups who have contacted us who want us to give more money to other kinds of projects. There are a lot of groups working on there's a reason the housing anti-displacement policy criterion is there. And those groups have a similar interest in trying to transform the, not to pick out one group, but trying to transform the way we think about our transportation system. That was not intentional. So there is this pressure not to spend as much money on local streets and roads, even though it is a pressing need.
One question, Brad. I'm assuming you probably need something concrete today from this committee, correct?
If we want to take it, we would like to take it to the planning committee and the authority in September so that we can release it in September and give you during the fall to put together the applications.
Okay. So given the fact that this could be the meeting that we decide whether to have comments or make any more revisions or basically vote on this today, right? If that's the case, I actually do share with Heather's position with regards to, we have the two pots, one for local streets and roads and one for the competitive portion. And we currently have 17.9, well, to say $18 million for competitive portion. I mean, it's one of those things that we're here debating what if scenarios, which we really do not know until we get the applications and see everybody's requests. What I propose is, it seems like either way you move forward, no matter what decision we take, and there could be projects that when the numbers doesn't add up or things we need to tweak later on during the award review process that for the time being, let's keep the 17.9 competitive portion as it is. If you want to set a cap to it, you can do an easy cap. There are 5 subregions in the county, correct? 4. Do a 4-way split, and that whatever number is, be the do not exceed, right, for each application for the 4 projects. And let's say the best case scenario is the requests come in low, we have money left over, so to speak, then we can debate at that point, because it's always easier to spend money. And that way we know, okay, this is the pot of budget that we have for competitive, that's what we have to work with. The various agencies, local streets and roads are untouched, that's what we can commit to, because at the same time we like to be able to take to our council saying, okay, this is approximately how much we can expect for local streets and roads from this program. And, it's more definitive to me that I can take back and sell to my council.
If we were to do that, if you were to say, okay, we've got 18 million, we've got 4 jurisdictions, 4 subregions, that's basically $4.5 million.
Correct.
That would have to be the maximum. Now, there is one instance where I don't know if it will happen, and I don't actually think that we would fund $4 or $5 million projects. That seems highly unlikely. But it just to have something so exact, it just seems improbable. It could happen, though. There is one instance where we would have to take money from the STP pot, and that would be if we had a plan, because you cannot use CMAQ funds to fund plans, and plans are eligible projects.
Well, you currently have a list of surveys from various jurisdictions for potential candidates, right?
Right, and no one submitted a plan, but in theory they could do so. The plans we're only talking maybe not $150,000, so it spread out. It would not be a very big reduction, if any.
I would say, just my personal opinion, that the chances are of a plan being the #1 rated project from a region is probably pretty low.
Well, I think you're right on that. But let's say you had a max of $4.5 million, and you had 3 $4.5 million and 1 $4 million. You'd still have 500,000. It's possible you could have You'd have to have a really big plan to be cost 500. No, maybe not. We have one in Walnut Creek right now that's 600 that they're getting a PDA planning grant for 650, I think. So it is possible.
Mr. Kursavan?
May I ask a question?
Sure.
Thank you, Jerry. Brad, do you have a sense of what the numbers would come out if instead of you just divided it by 4, if you did it on a base population and road mileage, how each of the 4 would do? Say close to 4.5? No one told you there was going to be math today, did they?
No.
Yeah, you might want to bring a
That I
calculator.
cannot do in my head.
You're going to have to
Sorry,
get a calculator.
Steve.
Just ballpark if you have it.
Hold on a second. I can get an approximation. It's going to be, well, no, it wouldn't be an approximation. I was thinking the Safe Routes to School would be close. Population. So,
That number is shown on 624.
I mean, if you want to, Steve, if you want to go through the list on page 625 and add up jurisdictions by subregion, if you want to do it now, and you'll be able to give us the answer. So get out your calculator. The short answer is no, I don't know it off the top of my head. I think that.
Well, Steve, what are you going after? Are you proposing to change a formula or something based on that, or?
You have four RDPCs, you got 18 million, you bought 4.5 regional. How does that compare to a combination where it seems like every other time we divide money, we have a formula in place? Here the formula is divided by 4. Kind of simplified.
This is subdivided by formula. I'm sorry, if I may, the OBAC competitive program is not going to be divided by formula. I mean, it's competitive. And we're just planning for worst case scenario. We get a lot of projects. The 4 top projects, they're all $4.5 million. Can we, in each subregion, can we still meet the other criterion we put, where we said we're going to fund the top project in each subregion as a minimum to maintain subregional equity. So we're not going to do formula for the competitive. I mean, that's for sure. But if I may add, I think reducing the maximum, we've heard from Leah, Yvette, from Barbara, and Heather, and they all are pointing in one direction, basically saying we probably need to consider reducing the maximum from the 5 million to something more like 4.5 million, basically to allow to reduce the chances of taking money from the STP funds. That's number one. And number two is, to make it look better if a much lower ranked project in sub-region need to be funded because it's the highest ranked in that sub-region. So instead of 5, it'll be 4.5. It helps a little bit, but it doesn't totally solve the problem. So I don't know if you all agree with this, but it seems like I don't see why we wouldn't accept that as a recommendation from TCC.
So I'm still a little bit confused on how you derived at the allocations for each of these jurisdictions, where some of them are receiving a lot more than others. I'm just confused about what that allocation measurement was, or what formula you used.
The formula is the formula that MTC established and which we used in the 2 previous calls for projects, the CMA Block Grant and OBAG 1. They're updated with new numbers that we got from MTC. It involves road miles, population, the pavement condition index number for the jurisdiction, as well as, I've forgotten the name of it, but there's a 4th criterion that's based on how much the jurisdiction has put in over the last several years to maintain their system. So you can't go over 100% of the need. You don't
So
get
we're gonna
extra point.
Okay, so we're going to always have a case where some of these jurisdictions that have allocated more money towards their road improvements will always receive more because they have done more, had a lot more revenue to do more with in the past years. Which
Well,
I don't think. Well, let me ask you one other question that would go along with that. So, what is the possibility of? I know this, I don't want to hold this up, but what's the possibility of MTC amending that language?
The formula?
The formula, yeah.
No, they're not going to do it. Not now. Not in the mid.
I said
not
what's the
midstream.
possibility? No possibility.
No, it's not going to
Well,
happen.
in the future, can it happen?
It could.
I would want to have maybe that conversation with MTC to have them take a look at that so that in future years, this can be a fair allocation.
Well, I think they think it's fair. They developed it with the local streets working group. That's one of their technical group, and they have staff people from. There may even be people who worked on that, and I know there's certainly people in this room who are on that or have been on that group.
There may have been people on that group, but obviously it's not represented by what's being discussed here today, that some people were not privy to those conversations or on that group to have a fair allocation for their cities or their jurisdictions. So I would want to have MTC visit that in the future. I know that there are committees and subcommittees on MTC that probably have made this decision that some of us here in this room today weren't privy to or have had that been able to make comments on. So, I mean, we're here now, so I just thought I'd offer that as some future discussion.
John, you're back on.
Thanks, Jerry. I apologize if you already covered this in the staff introduction, Brad. I walked in a little bit late. But for the criteria that have the asterisk, that they're flagged for CCTA scoring, I would like to see that there's some opportunity for the applicants, I guess, to provide some narrative or clarification. Not all of those. I think there's quite a few of those questions that only are more. It's more likely that the project sponsor will be savvy to some nuances that a group scoring, an entire stack of applications wouldn't be, they wouldn't know. I think it'll expedite the review process. It'll reduce the amount of back and forth. I assume at the end of this, there's recommendations going to be presented, and I think it'll be, as far as process goes, it'd be easier to address whatever possible errors are in the scoring earlier in the process than at the end. Either that or have the applicant do all the criteria and then just have the review committee check it for accuracy. But I do think there's a potential for unnecessary errors with those questions flagged for initial CCTA review.
I'm open to that. If you want us to add questions and requests for data, we tried not to make this an ATP application. That was our intent to do some of the work for local staff, but that is a danger. I don't think we will intentionally make errors, and we were certainly going to review all of the analysis first with the review committee and also with TCC before we take any recommendation for funding to the planning committee and to the authority. But if the group thinks that you want to have an opportunity to answer every criterion, we're certainly willing to add those questions.
John's got to follow up real quick.
Just quick clarification. Yeah, I didn't mean to suggest that the process would be prone to errors. Just as by way of example, the website suggested to be used for the housing displacement policies. There's no data for counties. It's only cities. So
I do have it.
Oh, you have? Okay.
Yeah,
well,
you have to ask for it.
Right. So anyway, there's a number of those where it's just the data just might not be there. So, but the locals would have that information.
At the working group meeting, we talked about having a check-in with the local jurisdiction to make sure that these had been interpreted or applied appropriately.
Yes, and that's certainly something I was hoping we could do. If there were any questions, and to make sure that, we did this the last time around, that we gave all the applicants an opportunity to review the scores, to make comments on them. And we were proposing to do that same thing this time, to give applicants a chance to comment on the scoring.
So can we add an explanation like
And
that?
that's what I would add in this the section that you mentioned earlier, is to fill in that process a lot more.
I have another question. So, for example, in the housing displacement policies, if you have housing that hasn't gone forward yet, but it is planned, it hasn't been entitled yet, is it not going to count? Are you only going to do what's actual? Or?
This is all about policy. It's not about how many housing units you've, how many permits you've permitted.
So you can have a policy and not follow up with it?
Yes, the policy is about anti-displacement. It's not, you can criticize MPC's decision to focus entirely on housing displacement instead of on affordable housing production. I mean, that was their choice. There's definitely housing displacement of lower income households is definitely an issue in the Bay Area. It's an issue more in some jurisdictions than others, and that's the reason why MTC decided to take this step and add this criterion.
Anybody else?
I had a quick question. Brad, do you know off the record or on the record how many applications or how many projects were identified when we did the input for these OBAG, TLC? How many jurisdictions or how many projects were logged?
We got about 60, 62, 65. I can't remember the exact number. Not every jurisdiction submitted one. There are 2 or 3 jurisdictions that didn't submit any. Not every jurisdiction that would get the local streets and roads preservation funding submitted a project specifically for that pot of money. So I'm assuming that there probably be another 15 or 16 local streets projects that would be added. So we're up almost to 80 projects.
Okay, and did I hear correctly that, and I was trying to look through the criteria, I didn't see anything that referenced the one application per funding pot. Is that somewhere in here that I missed? Or
no, it
is
is not somewhere you missed. That is something we're suggesting to add to this.
I have a slight concern with that because I think many jurisdictions have identified several projects that rely on these funding sources, whether they're more of a OBAG 2 competitive pot or they're more regionally based that are evaluated on an RTPC level. And I think there's a potential that some jurisdictions may actually want to go for more than one, would have identified more than just one project that would be eligible for these funds. And they may have done so in a timing expectation that the first project could be done in, let's say, 2017, 2019, and the second project could be done 2019 to 2022. I mean, this is a fairly long project cycle. And I don't recall that there was ever any limitation to the number of applications that could be scored or evaluated by either CCTA or the individual RTPCs. And I don't know if there's any other jurisdictions that have any concerns, but I would have a concern with that one application limitation. Because there may be some very valuable projects that are out there that could get funded, but they don't get funded because applications are being forced to only select one. So that's my comment.
Well, it'd be 3, but
But each of them have different funding criteria.
Yes, they do.
And so obviously, there's only one pot to go for if you're actually looking for planning money, and there's different kinds of other pots to go for other monies. So
right. We were trying to balance 2 things. One, we wanted everyone to have an opportunity to apply for these different funding programs. Given the limited amount of funds, not every jurisdiction will be able to get a project from every funding program. And having, let's see, 20 for the local streets and roads, and 20 plus for the competitive, 20 plus for the local, for the Measure J TLC, 20 plus for the PBTF. And we're talking a lot of different projects to review, especially when you're starting to get trying to match projects and shift funding around at the end of the process. So that's if we just get 1 per jurisdiction, and then you add in the county, if they get more than 1, then you're getting even more projects potentially to score. Now, if you start saying, well, you apply for as many as you want, that could end up, that's going to be a lot of projects. And if, let's say, you're on the working group, which you are, you would be involved in reviewing a large number of projects. So we're trying to balance having enough projects to and be able to spread funding around, but not have so many projects that it's overwhelming.
And I appreciate that response. The only thing that I'll say is that the intention that I understood for combining the call for projects was to streamline the application processes and make it easier for jurisdictions to apply. It seems by adding this extra limitation, we're streamlining it, but we're also potentially excluding, which if these were each their own individual call for projects, the question that I would ask is, would we still be having that 1 project limitation being applied? And I don't recall that during the last OBAG cycle or for the TLC or PBTF.
It's one application. I mean, this would really apply, the intention is for the competitive OBAG funding for the TLC and the bike pit type of projects. Not, I'm not really concerned about the Measure J and the PBTF bike pit program, but the competitive OBAG funding in the past, I think it was a mistake. We made a mistake where we didn't put a limit on the number of applications we want to get from each jurisdiction. That was, if you remember, during the federal stimulus funding. And we got over 120 applications for like $15 million, and from like 4 or 5 from each jurisdiction. And we thought, okay, well, would it be better if each jurisdiction decides what's their top priority and just submit that for us to review? So we want the goal here is to keep the process manageable in terms of scoring and meeting the deadlines and so on. Keep in mind, there is a minimum size for each project, so we don't want to really get really small projects, but also is to hopefully help you make a determination ahead of time. What is your top priority projects you want to compete for? And again, I think here we're only focused, we're not talking about the local streets and roads. That's formula. We're gonna get 1 application. That application, you can have multiple streets to be fixed, so that shouldn't be an issue there. I'm really concerned about the OBAG competitive funding. And if you think 1 is too low, maybe 2 is a number, but I really hope that you can put a limit so it's not really hundreds of projects we have to go through, and these are not, based on the criteria, they're not going to be easy to score and rank.
I guess my concern wasn't so much with OBAG limitation because those are going to be regionally competitive.
Yeah.
My concern was more on the TLC and the PBTF, which PBTF is certainly evaluated by the Countywide Bike and Ped Advisory Committee, but the TLC is by subregion.
Right.
And ultimately, the subregion will be evaluating as many or as few applications that come in, and then they will be forwarding those recommendations based on the available funding to the authority. So I don't know, I'll let the other committee members speak, but I'm not as aggrieved by the OBAG limitation, but I am with Measure J. I do think that we shouldn't be placing that limitation on there.
Comment in the corner? Sorry.
So I did have a question, I guess, about the most effective housing anti-displacement policies. I wasn't sure if there was a minimum period of time that these policies needed to be in place. And how do you measure effectiveness? Because to me, effectiveness is you tested it and it worked. It really did stop people from getting displaced. But I'm not sure how the objectivity of this criteria.
I understand your concern, and when I read the word effective requires certain criteria and analysis to figure out if the policy has done what it was intended to do, how well it has prevented displacement of lower income households. And a policy that might be effective in one jurisdiction one time might not be as effective in another jurisdiction at another time. We don't have much time to, it seems like we have a lot of time, but when you look at the schedule, we don't actually have a lot of time to try to go through this process and give jurisdictions time to put together their applications. And we've suggested relying on urban displacement analysis and assume that the policies that they have identified as effective are, in fact, generally effective in locations where they're applied. We do not, I don't know how exactly, if you can suggest something, I'm certainly open to it, and how we might decide whether one kind of anti-displacement policy is more effective and should get more points than another.
Did the policy need to exist for a certain period of time, or is it?
No. Though the survey was done within the last year and a half, so it's whether the jurisdiction during that period when the survey was done had it adopted these certain policies, and they have a set of policies, and whether or not the jurisdiction had those policies in place at that time of the survey. And they are assumed, since I'm not sure that I really, since I'm not a housing planner, that I or anyone else in the authority has the expertise to know whether that policy is effective in that jurisdiction or not.
Barbara?
I'd like to go back to the one limitation of one project per category. And I agree that if you limit it, the ones who win out on the competitive OBAG would also have a chance to compete for some of the other categories. If you were allowing the other agencies to have more than one application for a category that they may have several projects, it might even out the distribution of the funds. Maybe what the agencies could do is prioritize their projects and say what their top 10 projects are, top 5 projects, whatever their number is. And if there's too many projects submitted for a certain category, if it's one of their top projects, then it would still be able to compete. If it's not one of their top projects, then their focus is in a different category. But I just think that would be a way of some of the agencies getting a bigger share of the pot.
And how would you word that? So that I might write that down if the rest of the TCC.
I know you're creative. I know you can do it.
I'll have to listen to the minutes and try to figure it out. Listen to the tape.
Yeah, Brad, I think this is a sort of similar process we did last year. I think last year we also had put a priority or numbers on applications for projects.
I think we did too, and I didn't have time to look it up.
So from my point of view, I think I'm agreeing with everybody spoken. I'd rather keep the same format of process we had last year and the same thing in the program right now. So.
I mean, one way, there are different options that if you think one is too restrictive, one per agency per program is too restrictive, that we could have a total of 4 or 5 applications for the competitive OBAG, TLC, and PBDF in total. That's one option. Since you can apply for one project for multiple sources of funding, that sort of adds to the number of people who are going to be reviewing a single project. The other is that you could add it, you can have different maximum applications for the different programs that are separate. You could say 1 for OBAG 2 and 2 or 3 for TLC and 2 or 3 for PBTF. So just as an example. I mean, there are a lot of different ways that you could approach this issue.
Yes.
I think that for the TLC funds especially, it should be up to the local region to decide what, where the projects are that they want to fund. So I don't think that for TLC specifically there should be any restrictions. I mean, the RTPC might decide that, all the money should go to these really important projects, and all those really important projects happen to be in one jurisdiction. Or not.
Sure.
Can I change the subject? Can you just say more about the surplus land resolution? You mentioned it at the beginning, and it's complying, I think, for the OBAG money, and you need to have a policy, or reso, I think you said. So I just don't, can you say more about that?
There's a little more complexity than I put in here as well, but there was a new, 2 years ago, 2014, there were some changes to the State Surplus Lands Act, and that change was to require jurisdictions to offer, when they were getting rid of surplus land, to offer it to developers of affordable housing. And there's a certain time frame. You can't get rid of your surplus land for a certain time period to allow to anyone but affordable housing developers. After that time, you can sell it to anyone. And you must have that in place. That's the requirement. You must adopt a resolution that says that that's what you're going to do before you can get these federal funds. And that's related to the affordable housing anti-displacement push, because it's meant to ensure that jurisdictions comply with state law and make sure they make the land available for affordable housing development. Now, there's a question about charter cities and whether this applies to charter cities or not, and there's a court case going on. San Jose is being sued over this, whether they comply or not with the state law and whether it applies to them or not. But I'm pretty sure we don't have any charter cities in Contra Costa. Is Richmond a charter? Okay. It may or may not, but the court case, if it's decided, you're going to have to adopt a resolution to get money.
So along those lines, the resolution, and it mentions in here that MTC hasn't provided a model, so we've got to go with a resolution without a model prior to applying. So if they come out with a
No,
model after that,
You have time. You have to adopt it before we submit the list of projects.
okay, so we have
to-
till June of 2017. So I think that it's not clear in here. It seemed like that was a fatal flaw if you don't have the resolution when you apply.
No, there's one other. I think it says it in the screening criteria. Let me make sure. If it doesn't, it should. Yes, it says, will the jurisdiction in which the project is located have adopted a surplus land resolution before the authority submits the recommended OBAG 2 projects? And when we submit the list of projects, we have to submit a whole bunch of things, including your resolutions. And there's a checklist that you will have to fill out along with your application that says you comply with all these things and attach all those various things. People who receive the OBAG 1 funding had to do it. It's slightly different because requirements have changed since OBAG 1, but it's in the basic same format.
Brett, two quick questions. Is it retroactive, or is it just at the point when the resolution moves forward? Would be the first question. And secondarily, does the Surplus Land Act that was passed circumvent local zoning authority? Because I would see in some cases where you have surplus land, maybe in the middle of an industrial park, it's probably not going to be the most appropriate to have affordable housing. So is there zoning considerations or land use considerations for the law that was passed on the state level?
I'm not familiar enough with state surplus lands law to know if there are any exemptions and whether you're exempt if the land is not zoned or planned for residential development. I don't know that.
I can see a situation just, hypothetically, not that it would work, but, a park, I can see in an area, that isn't being used as parkland, could that all of a sudden, revert to a, housing, affordable housing? So, that's just one case scenario outside of like an industrial, but that would be interesting to know if there's any provisions. I think the model ordinance from MTC is going to be key to be able to understand, so that way it doesn't end up raising a lot more questions than necessarily than it needs to be, and especially because there's not a lot of direction, and yet the call for projects is going to be going out in a month. So that's not leaving a lot of time for jurisdictions to adopt the resolution and have it in place. I guess it will by the application deadline, but there may be some follow-up questions.
Yeah, there's still some questions that we have about what exactly is required and what MTC will require as proof, and what the resolution has to contain. That's one of the remaining questions, just like the exact language for the housing anti-displacement policy requirement. But you do have 10 months to do it, so we should be able to, I'm hoping that we'll have something that can go out, a link that can go out to jurisdictions about that issue, so you can find where the model resolution is. We do have a link, that we will have a link in the application to say the complete streets resolution, though every jurisdiction that needs to have one has adopted one, except for the county. The one jurisdiction isn't in compliance with the complete streets requirement yet, though I know you're working towards it.
Okay, so so on this items, are you expecting us to approve it? Is that the action you want us to take today? To prove item, or is this informational?
Yes.
Okay.
No, it's not informational.
Okay, so for the sake of time, I'm sorry. I like to just go ahead and put it, make a motion.
Well, I had a couple comments first, and I think, Annie, you were moving in?
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. Just a real quick question. So is this resolution going to be required of jurisdictions that are just going to be receiving STP for local streets?
Any
It's
of
across
that
the
money,
board?
local streets
Okay.
or competitive.
All right.
I did have a few more. So on 6-37, where it talks about eligible sponsors, it lists local jurisdictions and transit agencies. Could RTPCs apply?
Can you receive federal money, STP and CMAQ funding?
Are you asking me that question?
Well, that's the criterion.
I don't know.
Yeah, you have to be able to receive federal money. There are certain requirements to do that. Not all RTPCs meet this requirement. I'm not sure about WICTAC. I think you may have already received federal money in the past.
I know the recent federal money we've received has come through the CCTA, and that was kind of our...
You got to get it directly this time.
So can that be added? So we can apply?
Yeah, we'll have to find out the status of each RTPC, so we'll be in touch with you.
Okay. And then what I'll call my last one has to do with more on the TLC criteria on the following page. What is it, 6-38? It talks about here that, let's see, under criteria, the third line, it says those projects that score the highest are the ones that are going to be selected for funding. And, you know, I don't think that's what the requirements are for TLC, and that I think the RTPCs would want to keep that flexibility that, you know, so they can decide how they want to select the projects that they want funded.
I have met with some of the RTPC tax, and we discussed the TLC program and its requirements. One of the requirements is that the funding not be allocated by formula to jurisdictions. And one of the tax mentioned that that's basically the way the funding in the last round was allocated.
But
we have tried to give flexibility to the RTPCs. Our proposal is to give flexibility in how they weight these different criteria. Our desire, and really our responsibility, is to ensure that the TLC funding, or any of the funding, is spent in the way that the program is designed to, the goals that the program is designed to achieve. In that case, there are a number of TLC goals that are explicitly spelled out, one of which is that the RTPCs give preference to projects that support affordable housing. That's quite explicit in the measure itself. And to do that, we're proposing that, and to do two things. One, on the one hand, to make sure that the projects recommended for funding are the ones that best achieve the goals of the Measures J TLC program. On the other hand, to give the RTPCs flexibility on determining how much weight they put on those different criteria that are called out in the program.
Right, but there's nothing in the expenditure plan language that explicitly says that it has to go to the highest ranking projects. Like the RTPCs have, it just says that working with the RTPCs, the authority would prepare guidelines and establish overall criteria. The RTPCs would review project proposals and make funding recommendations to the authority. So, you know, I think the RTPCs can decide in a number of ways that aren't by formula how it wants to distribute those funds.
Well, how are we going to know, and how is the public going to know that the RTPC has chosen the projects that best meet the purposes of the program?
Will they meet the criteria?
How are you going to demonstrate that they meet the criteria?
You have an application that you, I mean, we had an application last time.
Yes, we had an application last time.
And it just calls for screening criteria.
But I'm still not quite understanding how you can demonstrate that the particular projects that you're recommending are the ones out of all the projects that applied.
Because it's the RTPC's priorities are the ones that they want to fund. That's how the original TLC was formulated. It wasn't a competitive program. It's to represent the priorities of that local RTPC. So if their priorities, they get to decide which projects that meet, if they meet the criteria. I mean, all I'm saying is that I think it's up to each RTPC to decide. But right here, or in this statement, it specifically says that it has to be the highest ranking, the highest score. And I would just like to see that reworded so it gives the RTPCs the flexibility to decide how they want to distribute the pot of funds that they've been given the authority to decide on.
Can I ask another
I saved
question?
my best one for last.
Yeah, you did. I have another question. Okay, so how long would it take how would this impact all these changes and conversations about making changes? Would that impact timing at all if you had to go back and do any of this?
Well, it would require me and the other staff here to rework this. But,
and then how would that impact anything that we, like timing for call for projects and things like that? I'm sure it would, right?
No.
Oh, wouldn't? Because I thought you said that the call for projects was coming out under, no?
I think the important part is we get a recommendation from the TCC today on what changes they want us to make to this. That's really what we're after. If we need more time to do it, we'll take more time, but that means you'll have less time putting the applications together. But from what I'm seeing from the conversations, I mean, I don't see areas of disagreement really. I mean, we talked about the max for the application. Is there somebody here that thinks it should be reduced from 5 to 4.5 million? Any opposition to that?
Nope.
Okay. Then the second one, we talked about the number of applications per jurisdiction. Is there an opposition to restricting that to one per jurisdiction for each of the programs? So you will have one for the TLC Measure J, one for the PPTF, one for the OBAC. There is an opposition. I see opposition. So let's figure out what the solution is. Can we make the restriction only to the OBAC competitive to one? And no restrictions on the Measure J and the PPTF? Are you okay with that? So I think we resolved that issue. The third issue.
Are you looking for should we formally make a motion and actually do something?
I think we should.
I guess it's so that.
I didn't see anything here where you're saying we need more time to discuss.
No.
Now, the third issue, which is, I think, critical, is whether we require ranking by the RTPC. And I think what we need from the RTPC is a recommended project list. What we would like and what the public would like is that you have basically a consistent process to ensure that the project you're recommending is consistent with the TLC goals and guidelines.
And I would add that we need to have some demonstration that the projects recommended are really the ones that best meet the purposes of the program. That's why you use criteria, is to winnow out those projects that don't meet them well and choose the projects that do. Ultimately, that's what we need. The criteria and the scoring is a way to achieve it and a way to demonstrate it. And and since it's done by the RTPC, it represents the RTPC's priorities.
If I may add to that as well, let's say WICTAC has a share of $5 million that we need recommendations of projects for, right? We would prefer that you give us a list of greater than $5 million, let's say $6 million, to allow us to figure out whether some of these projects, if they applied for multiple fund sources, OBAC, Measure J, TLC, or the PPDF, to allow the committee that's going to be scoring and ranking the projects and figuring out what fund source goes to what project, to have the flexibility to make the decision. If you only give us a list of 5 million with these projects only, then what's the point of doing a one call for project and having the committee review all the project lists? So I think that's why we really need somehow a ranked list. It's
right,
not
but it doesn't have to be based on this scoring. I'm not disagreeing that you guys need a list of projects, but it's for the RTPC to decide what what their decision making process is.
I mean, the criteria, even the last time, there was a criteria for the TLC program, right?
There
was
was.
approved by our board.
But it doesn't.
Can I make a suggestion that you just soften the language? And maybe it's too harsh and says only, and it's just, you can revise it to say based on evaluation criteria published or, developed by the RTPCs. And a scoring system. I mean, there's still a scoring system. Just like the CCTA is getting some flexibility to, they're not going to select maybe the highest 4 scoring projects overall. It's potentially just per subregion that you give the RTPCs the same flexibility to.
I think what we really need is something from the RTPCs that assures us and the public that the projects that you're recommending are ranked in order of those that best achieve the purposes of the program. That's really what we need to demonstrate to the public.
But I think it's the RTPC's priorities.
Number 1, by the way, if you want.
Pardon?
And they all can be number 1. They all scored equally.
But I think it would help to soften that language. There's a lot of very direct.
Short of just scrapping criteria and having the RTPCs invent their own process, and I'm not suggesting that, but let's say that we do establish kind of weighting based on these criteria and we come up with a ranking of projects. But, things can happen whereby, let's say that the top-ranked project would take all the money, but maybe they don't necessarily need all the money, and there's a project that's a close second, and that first-ranking project, that project sponsor might be willing to give up a small amount of money to let a second-place project also come in. Those kinds of things could be sorted out, I think, within the RTPC if there was that kind of flexibility. So are we going to be in a situation where not only do we have to rank these, but the top-ranked project automatically is fully funded, and then the second-ranked project, if there's room, is fully funded? Or can we have a little bit of wiggle room to try to allow more projects? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Good. That's it for me.
I just had a couple, just if you could explain it, that'd be fine. One was who's on the review committee. I think you mentioned that it may be made up as part of this working group.
Well, that's what we were going to propose.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what we're proposing, that the working group to help put together the program would review the project. They would review the OBAC competitive. They'd also try to do this, work with us to do the mixing and matching of program funding.
Okay, and then the last one was, I think you answered this to me last time, but I didn't write it down, was the failure under project delivery record. What was the failure? Was it losing money or was it red flag?
It's it's losing money. It's actually MTC taking the money away from you for you not meeting the OBAG deadlines, basically.
Okay, just wanted to make sure.
If I may continue, I think, so we agreed on the max, we agreed on the number of projects per jurisdiction.
Selfishly, I wanted to ask, because originally you said 2 for the county on that, so did it go to 1?
I think 2 for the county, I think should get 2 because it's a bigger jurisdiction. You're okay with that? Okay. And then the other things we talked about include clarifications, whether RTPCs can apply. We'll look into that. Clarification about the actual land use versus zoned land use. And to add some information in the ranking process that jurisdictions will have an opportunity to review the scoring after we're all said and done, I guess. And I think and the clarifications on whether we get any clarification from MTC on the surplus land ordinance by the time we issue that call for projects.
Actually, I had a question about, you're saying still limiting one application for the OBAG pot of money. When you say limit per jurisdiction, it's actually per project sponsor. Like, let's say BART wants to submit an application. They could submit one, and then the city of El Cerrito could submit one we're still in the same jurisdiction.
Yes.
Okay.
Per sponsor, that's a good point.
Okay.
And one point was brought up, regional significance. Do we still want to talk about that? Do we give more points to projects that span more than one jurisdiction? Or we don't want to talk about it?
I think that was a comment that was made in relation to if we were going to reduce the SDP money, and then we went back and changed that, so I don't know that we need that.
Okay, so
But that's just
no
my opinion.
changes on that. With these changes, is this acceptable? Now you can take your vote. We have some TCC voting members right there too.
Hisham, your list was meant to be a comprehensive list of changes to feed into a motion. I thought there was some agreement to provide applicants the option for input into criteria being scored by CCTA. And I didn't know there was opposition to that. Maybe there was. I don't. Okay. And then second thing that maybe Heather's comments, maybe it was fixed and I wasn't aware. There was concern about the reduction in formula dollars. Was that addressed with some of the other changes?
Yes, by reducing the maximum from 5 million.
Oh. Okay, great. Thank you.
So since you're saying the county can submit 2 applications, so since BART is regional as well, could we also submit 2? Could we make that adjustment?
Any opposition?
Okay, thank you.
Quick clarification, a joint application by 2 project sponsors or 2 jurisdictions, does that automatically rule out for both of them? Or does that give it some consideration? Because we do like regional cooperation, I think.
What if you have 3?
The way we had the application so far, the first draft that I did was it had the sponsor and then the implementing agency. And we haven't had joint sponsorship. You could deal with it in a couple of different ways. One, you can just say someone has to be the sponsor, even though it's being done jointly. Or you could say, if it's a joint, you can also get a joint sponsorship and allow an extra project if it's done jointly with another agency, give an exemption for those joint ones. We haven't gotten very many of those in the past. That's another option.
I just had,
Yeah, so
I just wasn't sure if in Hisham's list, did it include the softening of that TLC section? And I don't know if we all nodded or shook our head for that.
I thought Hisham did.
Yeah, there was a long list. I wasn't sure what got included. Can you speak in the microphone? Thanks.
I think what I'm saying, we probably need a little bit more time to figure that one out. I think your point is well taken. Maybe that's a comment we make to the planning committee that this is something you asked for. And we'll figure out a way to achieve both the flexibility for the RTPC as well as what we initially wanted, which is assurance that the list that you're providing to us meets the goals of the TLC program.
So I move approval of Hisham's proposed changes with the caveat that the CCTA staff worked towards making those improvements to that TLC criteria section.
Got a motion? Do I have a second?
Can I just get a clarification? What did we agree on the multiple jurisdictions? The joint projects? What do you want to do about
Jerry?
that?
I suggest we add, oh, sorry.
I liked your idea, Brad, of a sponsor or a lead, because I like accountability. Even in a joint project, I prefer that either my agency is responsible or the other agency is the ultimate responsible, even though we're both working cooperatively.
So that's one. So that's, you're suggesting that you just get to apply for one, even if it's joint?
Yes, because that would leave the other agency the opportunity as well.
So there will be only one sponsor, basically. We won't have an application with more than one sponsor. We can have one with multiple implementing agencies.
For OBAG, correct?
For OBAG, just
Okay.
for OBAG.
The TLC and the PBTF is different. Perfect.
No limit on that. We didn't put any limit on that. Okay.
I have a motion. I'm looking for a second.
I'll second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes.
Thank you, guys.
Looks like you're on for item number 7.
I am, in fact, on for item number 7. I've been keeping track of and trying to report periodically on the progress of implementation of the projects that were funded through programs 12 and 13, TLC and PBTF. We did a monitoring report last year. There's a proposed monitoring report in your packet today. I've got 5 bullets that summarize changes from the last one. Since the last one, we programmed 2 new East Bay Regional Park District projects, one in West County, one in Southwest County. The Park District gets 1/3 of the PBTF funding, and they are required to spend it equally in the 4 different regions. We also took one of the projects that was funded through TLC and split it into 2 separate projects. So basically, we eliminated one project and added 4 others. So there are now 45 projects in the list. We've appropriated all but $188,000 of the funding that was previously programmed, and that's for one project in Pinole that we haven't done the appropriation. The city is still trying to figure out exactly what it wants to do with the funding. Sponsors have invoiced for about $10 million of the $21 million, or about 46% of the funding appropriated. Since the last report, 8 projects have been completed. Yay. Of only 7 of the 45 projects met their original schedule, some by not much and some by quite a bit. The average delay was almost 2 years. And there are a lot of different reasons for that. It's not surprising that there's some delay in projects, given that you always end up coming up with complications that you didn't foresee originally. But those are the highlights of the monitoring report, and there's lots of detail in the report itself. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
I see no questions, Brad. Well done.
Go team.
All right.
Get those projects done, please.
All right, I'd like to adjourn this meeting. Any other comments? We are adjourned.